Imagine sitting down in a public restroom and realizing the person beside you is your school principal or a complete stranger. There are no walls between you, no door to close, and now they are casually asking what you thought of yesterday's game. It sounds like a nightmare, but in ancient Rome, it was just another ordinary morning. Public toilets were not merely places to take care of private business. They were social spaces where people met, traded news, and chatted about everyday life. And somehow, it gets even stranger. Roman public toilets often consisted of long stone benches with rows of holes cut close together. Dozens of people could sit shoulder to shoulder, talking as calmly as if they were relaxing in a cafe. No doors, no partitions, almost no concept of please do not disturb. The only real cover came from their loose, flowing togas, which they pulled down around their legs. It was a simple solution, though probably not a very effective one. But wait, we have not reached the most shocking part yet. After using the toilet, Romans often cleaned themselves with a sponge attached to the end of a wooden stick. The disturbing detail is that the stick did not belong to one person. It was shared. Afterward, the sponge was rinsed in the stream of water running beneath the seats or dipped into a bucket, then left behind for the next person. It sounds like a bizarre historical joke, except it was completely real. That raises a much bigger question. Did ancient people truly understand the idea of privacy? We often imagine privacy beginning with private bedrooms, locked doors, and signs that say, "Keep out." But here's the thing. The desire to hide information is far older than any house, city, or lock. It may have existed before modern humans even appeared. Travel back roughly 6 million years. There were no apartments, passwords, or personal diaries, but secretive behavior was already part of the animal world. Chimpanzees know how to hide food from dominant members of their group. They may even pretend to have no interest in a potential mate when a rival is watching. Why put on an act? Because sometimes survival depends on keeping others from knowing what you want. That may be one of the earliest forms of secrecy. Around 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens began showing a clearer sense of individual identity. When they buried the dead, they did not always simply place a body in the ground and walk away. Some graves were decorated with red stone, shell beads, or objects that carried special meaning. This suggests that each person was being remembered as a distinct individual. And once humans began asking, "Who am I?" they may also have realized that certain thoughts, possessions, and memories belonged to me alone. But there was a problem. Stone Age life offered almost no chance to be alone. Groups of roughly 20 to 50 people ate, slept, worked, and rested around the same fire. Everyone heard the snoring, the coughing, the arguments, and probably knew exactly who always grabbed the biggest piece of meat. There were no bedrooms, no living rooms, and certainly no mute button. So how did people avoid going insane when someone was always watching? The answer was not found in stone walls, but in invisible ones. Ancient communities may have developed unspoken rules about where to look, how to stand, and when to leave someone alone. Everyone shared the same physical space, but they did not constantly pay attention to one another. Privacy did not come from architecture. It came from social agreement, the understanding that sometimes you were expected to pretend not to notice what was happening right in front of you. One of the most important rules was deliberate ignoring. When someone turned toward a rock wall, crouched in the corner of a shelter, or separated themselves from the group, everyone else looked away. The person had not truly disappeared, but the community behaved as though they had become temporarily invisible. It is surprisingly similar to the way we suddenly find an elevator ceiling fascinating when we are standing too close to strangers. Humans have always needed polite ways not to look at one another. Ancient people also had two remarkably effective tools: darkness and distance. As night fell and the fire began to fade, a few people could move away from the group and whisper about things they did not want everyone else to hear. Sometimes walking just 15 meters beyond the firelight was enough. In the darkness of the prehistoric world, that small distance could make someone almost disappear. No locked door, no private room. Just a few steps into the night and a community that understood it was sometimes better not to follow. Even going to the bathroom outdoors came with an unspoken rule of politeness. When someone quietly left camp and disappeared into the forest, Everyone pretended not to notice. No one asked where they were going, and more importantly, no one followed. There were no physical walls, but deliberate ignorance created an invisible barrier around them. But privacy was not only useful during awkward moments. Ancient people also seem to have had charming little interests of their own. Archaeologists have found unusually colored stones, animal teeth, and seashells carried hundreds of miles from where they originated. These objects could not help anyone hunt or start a fire. Perhaps they were simply personal treasures, things someone loved and wanted to keep for themselves. Here is where it gets interesting. Many of the most beautiful cave paintings were not placed where everyone could easily see them. They were hidden deep inside dark, difficult passages. Reaching them sometimes meant crawling through narrow cracks with only a torch for light. Those images of ancient horses and bulls may not have been created for the entire group to admire. They may have been part of a deeply private experience between an individual and the natural world. Once people began owning personal possessions, a very familiar problem appeared almost immediately: theft. Human beings, after all, have always been human. To protect their small treasures, people hid them underground, wedged them into rock crevices, or placed them in corners others were unlikely to notice. And with that, a new layer of privacy emerged. People were no longer hiding only their thoughts. They were also hiding their belongings from other people's eyes. But the hardest thing to conceal was emotion. In a small tribe, every expression could be noticed. Ancient people may have learned to smile when they felt miserable and stay calm when a predator appeared, even while panic was racing through them. Anyone seen as too weak or too dangerous to the group risked being cast out. And in those days, exile was often little different from a death sentence. Then, around 10,000 years ago, everything began to change. Humans learned to farm, settle down, and remain in one place instead of constantly moving. Houses made from mud brick or stone began to appear. For the first time, privacy no longer depended entirely on unspoken social rules. People had real walls strong enough to keep out the wind, wild animals, and perhaps a few overly curious neighbors. But wait, humans had started dividing their living spaces long before permanent stone houses appeared. At Ohelo II, Israel, archaeologists uncovered brush huts dating back roughly 23,000 years. Inside, grass bedding was neatly arranged around a central hearth. Areas used by women for grinding grain were separated from the space near the entrance where men made stone tools. Even a simple hut could contain clear boundaries. Thousands of years later, privacy became even more visible at the stone village of Skara Brae in Scotland. The houses stood close together, yet each one had only a very low entrance, forcing visitors to bend down before stepping inside. Even more remarkably, the stone doors could be secured with wooden or whalebone bars. For perhaps the first time, a homeowner could send a very physical message. Not today. Inside, the houses looked strangely similar. Stone beds, cupboards, and shelves for displaying personal objects were built into the walls in nearly identical positions. This suggests that the entire village shared a common idea about how life should be organized. Every family had its own space, belongings, and boundaries, but they still followed a common structure that kept the community from slipping into chaos. The problem was that Skara Brae was cold, windy, and often battered by harsh weather. So the villagers connected their homes with roofed passageways, allowing them to visit neighbors without stepping into the freezing wind outside. It sounds like a community where no one could ever escape one another, but each family could still secure the passage into its own home. They wanted to live close together, just not so close that anyone could walk in whenever they pleased. Now imagine standing before a city with no streets. It sounds impossible, but that was Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. Thousands of mud brick houses were packed together like a giant beehive, with no roads or alleys between them. People did not walk along the ground to visit their neighbors. They moved across the rooftops, which served as streets, playgrounds, and gathering spaces for the entire community. But without doors at ground level, how did anyone get inside? The answer was directly overhead. Each family entered by climbing down a wooden ladder through an opening in the roof. That single opening served as the doorway, the window, and the chimney for the household fire. It turned each home into a surprisingly private fortress. No one could casually glance inside from the street because, technically, there was no street to stand on. But here is where things get strange. The people of Çatalhöyük buried their own relatives beneath the sleeping platforms inside their homes. During the day, they ate and worked above them. At night, they slept directly over the graves of their ancestors. It may sound unsettling to us, but to them, the house protected more than the living. It preserved family memory, turning private space into a bond that stretched across generations. By the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, houses had begun to turn their backs on the street. Their outer walls were usually smooth and nearly windowless, keeping out dust, noise, and curious eyes. Outside, the city could be hot, crowded, and chaotic. Inside, the rooms opened onto a cool central courtyard. The home was no longer just a shelter. It had become a private world built around the family. The Sumerians also came up with a clever architectural trick. The front door did not open directly into the courtyard. Visitors first entered a small transitional room, then turned a 90-degree corner before they could see the rest of the house. That meant people passing outside could not casually peek in to see what the family was eating or arguing about. It was the ancient equivalent of quickly hiding your screen when someone walks into the room. That entrance room served another thoughtful purpose. Guests arriving from dusty streets could wash their feet with water kept near the doorway. The dirty water drained away through a small channel before they continued farther inside. So the boundary between outside and inside was not just a door. It was a ritual. Leave the dust of the world behind before entering the family's private space. The farther you moved into the house, the more private the space became. The outer courtyard was used for receiving guests and carrying out daily work. Rooms in the back were reserved for family life. The deepest areas often contained clay tablets recording property and contracts, along with a small household shrine. In other words, the family's most valuable things, their wealth, secrets, and beliefs, were kept farthest from the eyes of strangers. Ancient Egyptian homes followed a similar pattern. Workers' houses were often divided into 3 sections. The front room received visitors, the middle room served as a shared living space with a hearth, and the deepest part of the house contained the sleeping area and storage for personal belongings. The farther someone was allowed to enter, the more the owner trusted them. Architecture had become a map of human relationships. For Egypt's wealthy families in Amarna, privacy reached another level entirely. Their villas stood behind high walls, guarded entrances, and waiting rooms for servants and visitors. The owner's bedroom was placed in the quietest corner of the estate. Some villas even had stone-lined bathing platforms and manually operated water systems, almost like an ancient shower, except the water pump was usually a servant holding a jar. But one of the most surprising reversals appeared in the Indus Valley more than 4,000 years ago. Centuries later, the Romans would still be happily using communal toilets, while the people of Mohenjo-Daro clearly preferred privacy. Almost every house had access to its own well and a brick-lined bathing area sealed against water. It is a reminder that privacy did not develop in a simple straight line. Sometimes an ancient civilization could have habits that feel remarkably modern. But private bathrooms were only half the story. In the cities of the Indus Valley, wastewater was not simply dumped into the street and forgotten. It flowed through clay pipes hidden inside the walls, then emptied into brick-lined drains beneath the roads. The cities even had access points that workers could open for inspection and cleaning. More than 4,000 years ago, these people understood something important. Privacy feels much better when it comes with proper sanitation. Once the home became private property, a new question emerged. What should happen to someone who broke into it or destroyed it? The Code of Hammurabi had a brutally direct answer. A person who tunneled through a wall to enter someone else's house could be executed at the scene. If a poorly built house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son could be put to death in return. The punishment was cruel, but it reveals how seriously the home was treated. It had become a space that others were not allowed to violate. The Romans also had to settle the same kinds of neighborly disputes that still cause arguments today. The 12 tables required buildings to stand a certain distance from property lines, roughly 2.5 feet, to reduce the risk of spreading fires and boundary conflicts. If a neighbor's tree branches grew over your land, you could demand that they be cut back. Apparently, people were arguing about fences, property lines, and troublesome trees thousands of years before modern homeowners entered the picture. In ancient India, the rules described in the Arthashastra went even further. People were not free to place doors or windows directly opposite a neighbor's home whenever they pleased. Spying through openings or secretly listening to private conversations could result in a fine. Think about that for a second. Long before security cameras and modern curtains, societies had already recognized a simple truth. A person's gaze could cross a boundary just as surely as an intruder could. But wait, the ancient world also had a kind of private space even more powerful than the home: sacred sanctuary. An escaped slave, an accused person, or someone being hunted could flee into a temple or church and ask for protection. Even the king's soldiers could not always rush inside and drag them away, because violating the sanctuary was considered an offense against the gods. Sometimes safety did not come from a strong lock. It came from the fear of divine punishment. Some people, however, wanted more than protection from soldiers or nosy neighbors. They wanted to escape society altogether. Ancient monks traveled deep into the desert, lived alone in tiny stone shelters, and devoted much of their time to prayer or meditation. No crowded markets, no arguments through the walls, no neighbor knocking to borrow something. It sounds peaceful until you remember that they gave up nearly every comfort of ordinary life in exchange for absolute silence. Even so, ancient people left behind their private thoughts in a surprisingly durable form. They pressed them into clay. Letters written around 5,000 years ago are filled with complaints about lazy relatives, unpaid debts, money problems, and personal disputes. One famous message even came from an angry customer furious about receiving poor-quality copper. History can make ancient people seem impossibly distant. Then a customer complaint appears, and suddenly they feel exactly like us. Modern privacy took another major step forward with the invention of something that sounds incredibly boring: the hallway. Before the 19th century, moving from one room to another often meant walking directly through someone else's space. Hallways changed that. They allowed people to reach their own rooms without interrupting anyone along the way. One narrow passage transformed the house into a collection of separate private worlds. The idea that every child should have a separate bedroom is even more recent. For most of history, parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives slept in the same room or even shared one large bed. It was only around the 1900s that individual bedrooms for children gradually became common. What feels completely normal today was once a rare luxury. And naturally, once children finally had rooms of their own, they quickly discovered the remarkable power of locking the door. Today, we have thick walls, strong doors, long passwords, and countless ways to keep other people out of our personal worlds. But here is the final twist. The easier it becomes to isolate ourselves, the easier it becomes to feel lonely. Humanity's search for privacy was never simply about escaping from other people. It gave us a quiet place to think, rest, and become ourselves. Sometimes we close the door not because we want to remain alone forever, but because we need a moment before opening it again and returning to the people outside.